A quick review of what we have seen last week. Last week, we have seen this example of Japan and the US. And we said that, for example, okay, this from here. Okay, the US use, where exactly? Okay, the US has 50,000 hours of labor. This is the resource it has. Okay, to produce, it can produce, one computer requires 100 hours of labor, and produce 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor. For Japan, that has 30,000 hours of labor, it uses 125 hours of labor to produce 1 computer and 25 hours of labor to produce 1 ton of wheat. Okay. If these two countries don't trade between themselves, each country will consume its production. Consumption will equal production because no trade between the two countries, and its US citizen or Japanese, its US citizen will consume the goods produced in the US, and each Japanese citizen will consume only the goods that are produced in Japan. Okay, and we talked about these slides. We make an assumption. Okay, we said suppose that the US produces decides to specialize in the production of wheat. Okay, and want to produce 3,400 tons of wheat. And Japan specializes in computers and decides to produce 240 computers. Okay. If this is the case, what would be the result? The US will produce then, to produce 3,400 tons of wheat, it needs 34,000 hours, labor hours. Okay. So only 3,000. So the remaining resources, labor resources that has, which is 16,000 labor hours, will be then used for production of computers, and which give 160 computers, unit of computers. Okay. Japan, by deciding to specializing in the production of 240 computers, this requires 30,000 labor hours. And Japan has 30,000 labor hours. So this means that Japan will use the totality of its labor resources for computer production. So no remaining time or remaining labor resources for the production of wheat. This means that Japan will produce 0 ton of wheat. Okay. Okay. So with this specialization, we assume that these two countries decide to trade between themselves. Okay. The US is producing plenty of wheat, so she accepts to export wheat to Japan. And Japan is in need of wheat because Japan production is not able to produce locally its wheat because it specialized in production of computers, and the quantity of computers decided by Japan to produce, consumer took all the available labor resources. Okay, so the US decides, okay, I can export 700 tons of wheat, and I want to import 110 computers from Japan. Japan accepts this deal. Okay, so we computed the production and consumption in each country of computers in wheat, and what we found. First, that we see here the consumption combination of goods and the production combination of goods are not the same point anymore. When there is trade, the consumption and the production are not in the same point anymore. The production is always on the PPF, but the consumption is, for both countries, Japan and the US, is always above the line PPF. Okay. So we try to see if this trade situation, when there is trade, was it good for what is how to say the payoff or the difference that comes with trade? Does it make difference? Does it make is it interesting? We compare it for each country consumption of without trade and consumption with trade, and we found that in each country, the US, the consumption with trade for computers and for wheat is higher, is larger than the consumption of computers and wheat without trade. This makes the US is consumed 20 more computers with trade. And with regard to situation without trade, with the trade, the US consumes 200 tons of wheat. Japan as well, with trade is able to consume 10 units of computers more than previously, and Japan was also able to consume 100 tons of wheat more than previously. So here we see that more and more US consumers and Japanese consumers are able to find or to afford the good they couldn't afford when there was no trade between two countries. So more and more consumers are able to afford this good, and more consumers are satisfied. So satisfaction means happiness. Okay. So this shows that with the trade, two countries, when they specialize in the production of specific good, when there is specialization, means they put most of their resources in the production of a specific good and import the other good, okay, this specialization with trade can make countries or even individuals better off. They are better off means they are consuming more goods and services than before. Consumption increase. Okay. So you see here there is gains from trade. These are the gains from trade. Okay. So there is an increase in consumption, an increase in consumption for each good in each country. Okay. Again, if you have any question, please ask. Don't interrupt me. Okay. So the question now. Okay. Why? Where do these gains come from? In other words, why these nations trade between themselves? Okay. Question is why these nations trade between themselves? Okay. There are different theories. Okay, economists have tried to understand why these nations trade between themselves. Okay, and they try to make many theories to explain that. Okay, one of the first theories that aim to explain why nations individual trade and why and that explains the origin of the gains from trade is the theory of absolute advantage. Okay, is the theory of absolute advantage. What do you mean by absolute advantage? Please pay attention because the two concepts you are going to see in the coming slides are very important. They look easy, but sometimes very confusing. Okay. So one of the first theories says, okay, maybe these countries or these nations or these individuals trade between themselves because they have absolute advantage in the production of something. The absolute advantage on the production of something means the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. The ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. If you have the ability to produce a good, let's say wheat or computer, using fewer inputs, okay, if I have the ability to produce, for example, computers using fewer inputs than another producer of computers, so I have an absolute advantage. By fewer inputs here, it means lower cost. Okay, by fewer inputs means lower cost. So this theory of absolute advantage is, okay, if myself, person A and let's say producer A and producer B. Okay, if producer A produces computer at a lower cost than the producer B, then producer A has an absolute advantage. And this theory that says that if I have the producer A has an absolute advantage, then he can trade, he can sell his goods he can sell, and producer B cannot sell his goods. So this is the theory that explained trade at the beginning. For example, here, the US has, do you see here, let's remember. The US, to produce one computer, the US requires 100 hours of labor. Okay, but in Japan, to produce one computer, it needs 125 hours of labor. So clearly the US has an absolute advantage. Sorry, it's an example of wheat. Let me, not computers, so let me again see. So to produce wheat, the US needs 10 hours of labor. But Japan needs, in Japan, to produce 1 ton of wheat, it requires 25 hours of labor. So you see clearly the US has an absolute advantage in wheat. Why? Because producing 1 ton of wheat in the US uses 10 labor hours, while in Japan it uses 25 hours of, okay, 10 versus 25. So the US uses,
Sure.
sorry, yes?
لهنا الانبوتس هما نفسهم الريسورسز.
Yes,
أنا
yes. Yeah,
okay.
yeah. The inputs are the resources. Input, you say there is input and there is output. You see, the input is the resources and the output is the production. Okay.
Okay.
So the input is the resources. Yeah. Input, it's English word, means yeah, resources. I use resources as an input. I input them in a machine to get an output. Okay.
Okay.
So here the US uses less resources, less inputs than fewer inputs than Japan. So we say that the US has in production of wheat. So the US has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat. And if the US uses fewer inputs than Japan in the production of wheat, this means that the US is able to produce 1 ton of wheat at a lower cost. Okay, at a lower cost. So economists at the beginning, they said, okay, countries, individuals trade, okay, because they trade the goods in which they have absolute advantage. So according to this theory, normally, if the US has an absolute advantage in wheat, so the US should sell wheat to Japan. So the US should export wheat to Japan. And it is then interesting for the US to specialize in wheat because it has an absolute advantage in wheat. Okay. So far, it looks like okay. And we have seen in this example, the US is exporting wheat, right? The US is exporting 700 wheat. So far the theory is not wrong. But wait a minute. So let's say which country has an absolute advantage in computers then? We finished with the wheat. The US has absolute advantage in wheat. So we expect normally that Japan has an absolute advantage in computers, and then Japan, and this would explain why Japan exports computers. But wait a minute, let's not go so fast. We see here in Japan, the production of one computer requires 125 labor hours. If you remember, this is the given information we gave in the previous before. But in the US, one computer requires 100 labor hours. 125 versus in Japan versus 120 in the US. So who has an, let me ask you, who has an absolute advantage in the production of computer here? Which country uses less or fewer inputs to produce one computer? Which country produces computer at a lower cost? Reem, Fershishi Reem.
Japan.
Who is talking?
It's near Reem.
Who?
Reem.
Yes. Please say your name because I don't know. Reem, which country has an absolute advantage in production of computers?
Japan.
Why?
Because in the US it takes too long to prepare a computer.
Because the US use what?
It takes longer labor hours to prepare a computer.
How much it takes in the US to produce, how much labor hours in the US to produce one computer?
100.
100. And how much it takes, how many labor hours it takes for Japan to produce one computer? Okay, I come back to you. So, which country has an absolute advantage in the production of computers? You said the US. I asked you why. Can you explain, tell me why?
Less hours to produce a computer.
Where?
What?
Where? Which country has an absolute advantage in the production of computers?
The US.
The US. Why? Because it uses less
hours to produce a computer.
So less inputs. Less inputs. Right?
Yes.
Do you agree with me, everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the US has an absolute advantage. So in the previous slide 21, we have seen that the US has an absolute advantage in wheat, in the production of wheat. In this slide also, we see that also the US has an absolute advantage in production of computers. So the US has actually an absolute advantage in both goods that exist in our model. Okay, it has an absolute advantage in both goods. Why? Because for the production of each good, it uses less or fewer inputs, fewer resources than Japan. So then why then Japan specialize in computers? And why then why there is both countries gain from trade, which means why these two countries trade? If the US has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat, and it has an absolute advantage in production of computers, if the theory of the absolute advantage is true, this means that the US would not trade with Japan because the US has an absolute advantage in the production of the two goods. But we have seen in this model, though the US has an absolute advantage in the production of the two goods, both countries specialize in production of one good, and both countries trade, and both countries gain from trade. The theory, clearly, this example shows that the theory of the absolute advantage, okay, does not explain the trade between two countries. علاش أسامة? Because here we have Japan, the US has an absolute advantage in the production of wheat and the production of computers, because for both goods, the US uses fewer inputs, fewer resources than the US. However, still we find here that the US trade with Japan. The US is able to sell something, wheat, to Japan, and Japan, though it does not have an absolute advantage in computers, it is able to sell computers to the US. So here explaining trade because of the absolute advantage is not correct. That is why this theory of absolute advantage was later removed, because it is a wrong theory. It couldn't explain the trade between countries. Okay, I'm going to the slide number 24. Do you see the slide number 24?
Yes.
Do you see a picture?
Yes.
With David Ricardo, who is an economist and who asked these questions, okay, why the absolute advantage is not correct theory to explain the trade, and he brought another theory that explains the trade between countries. Okay, if you don't like that comparative advantage, it's, you can ignore it, okay, but I find it is important to show the course of history and how things evolved. Okay, David Ricardo is one of the most influential, is 1772, 1823, is one of the great economists in history after Adam Smith, and he brought a theory explaining international trade, which he called not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage. You see, so here the confusion I want you to be careful about. And understand the comparative advantage needs to understand absolute advantage first. So the idea, the law of comparative advantage brought by this economist, he says the idea that economic agents are more efficiently employed in activity in which their relative efficiency are superior to others. So here he talks about relative efficiency. Relative efficiency means relative efficiency on the production of one good with respect to the production of another good. He doesn't talk like in the absolute advantage. We don't mean absolute cost, but here we are going to talk about relative costs. Okay, relative costs. So the concept of relative costs. What does this mean? You remember we have, what does this mean? I'm going to this, the slide number 25. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What does this comparative advantage idea about? The comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Okay. Here, the decision, the comparative advantage is not like the absolute advantage based on cost, but it is based on the opportunity cost. I hope you remember the opportunity cost. We defined it in the last week. The opportunity cost is the opportunity cost of something is what you give up, to obtain something. The opportunity cost is what you give up to get an item. Okay, the opportunity cost of something is what you give up to get the opportunity cost of an item, of a good or something, is what you give up to get that item. Okay. For example, as I said, we have seen last week many examples of opportunity cost. Studying one more year at college, you remember? Okay. If I want to study one more year at the university, what I should give up? I should give up finding a job and gaining salary and wages. So this is the opportunity cost. It is a relative cost. So here the comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower, not a lower cost, like in the absolute advantage definition, but at a lower opportunity cost. Okay, the concept of opportunity cost is important, and it is important here to the opportunity cost is not the same as absolute cost, and comparative advantage is not the same as absolute advantage. Maybe here to answer the previous question, to understand better the comparative advantage, we should distinguish it with respect to the absolute advantage. Okay. Yeah, a country has a comparative advantage in the production of a good if this country produce that good at a lower opportunity cost than another country. A producer has a comparative advantage in the production of a good. This means that this producer has the ability to produce that good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. So let's see, go back to our example and see which country has comparative advantage in computers. So which countries has a comparative advantage in computers? Is it Japan or the US? To understand, to know which country has a comparative advantage, we need to know the opportunity cost of computers in each country. Okay, to know which country has a comparative advantage in computers, we need to know the opportunity cost of computers in each country. Okay, so to answer this, must determine the opportunity cost of computer infrastructure. Okay, I'm going to the slide number 26. Are you following me?
Yes.
So let's see the opportunity cost of computer in both countries, the US and Japan. What is the opportunity cost of producing? Go back to the previous slides. Okay, you see me the slide number 6? You see me the slide number 6?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
For example, here the US says producing one computer requires 100 hours of labor. Okay. So the opportunity cost of computers in the US. How many tons of wheat I gave up? How many tons of wheat the US gave up?
900.
إذا احنا 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours of labor.
10 tons.
Okay, 100 of labor could produce 10 tons of wheat. يعطيك الصحة ريان. How many? 10 tons of wheat. صح ولا لا؟ Do you agree?
Yes.
لأن this is the answer to the opportunity. The opportunity cost of computers is equal to 10 tons of wheat. The opportunity cost of a computer is equal to 10 tons of wheat. ايش معناه؟ Because I gave up the production, the US gave up 10 tons of wheat to produce one computer. This is the opportunity cost. So it is not like in the absolute advantage. It is not how much resources I used to produce one computer. Here the cost is different. It's not how much resource I used to produce one computer, but it is how much wheat I gave up to produce computers. This is the opportunity cost. And here, Mr. David Ricardo says, okay, maybe we couldn't to understand why countries specialize or trade, because maybe we looked to the wrong type of costs. We should not maybe talk about, let's not maybe talk about the cost, but we should look to the opportunity cost. Okay, so the opportunity cost of a computer is 10 tons of wheat, as we have seen just now, because producing a computer requires 100 labor hours, which instead could produce 10 tons of wheat. Here for the US, for Japan, the opportunity cost of computers is how much? هنرجع نشوفوا Japan. You see here? Producing one computer requires 125 hours of labor. And producing 1 ton of wheat requires 25 hours of labor. So the opportunity cost, the opportunity cost of a computer in Japan. How many tons of wheat?
5.
of wheat, Japan should give up producing. Okay. How much? شكون يتكلم؟
مي ريم.
ريم اعطيني اسم حتى انا قاعد نغزر مش الاسامي تو. I'm looking to the slides. You said how much? 5
tons.
5 tons of wheat. 5 tons كيفاش عرفتها 5 tons هذيك؟ Because produce 1 ton of wheat is 25 needs 25 hours. هكا ولا 125 hours for the production of one computer divided by 25 hours for the production of wheat give us 5. Okay, so in Japan to produce one computer, it should give up 5 tons of wheat. Which country has the lowest opportunity cost of in the production of computers? Is it the US or Japan?
Japan.
Japan, because the opportunity cost of computers of a computer in the US is 10 tons, but in Japan it is 5 tons, only 5 tons. So Japan has a comparative advantage in computers. Okay. Either when we do the same thing, the opportunity cost, we do the same work we calculate the opportunity cost of wheat in each country. Trust me, we will find that the US has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. We will find that the US has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. Okay, so here, if you have, so the US has a comparative advantage in production of wheat, and Japan has a comparative advantage in the production of computers. So let's say, does comparative advantage theory explains trade? Yes, it explains trade. You could demonstrate that trade between nations, producers or nations, is explained by the comparative advantage, not the absolute advantage. Countries export specialized production and export the good in which they have a comparative advantage. Okay, I think this is slide number 27. Are you with me in the slide number 27? Slide number 27.
Yes.
Gains from trade arise from comparative advantages. Comparative advantage means differences in opportunity costs. When each country specializes in the goods in which it has a comparative advantage, total production in all countries is higher. The world's economic pie is bigger, and all countries can gain from trade. If each country specialized, the most important word is specialization. Specialize. لهنا شفنا احنا the US has specialized in the production of wheat because it has comparative advantage in production of wheat. Japan has specialized in computers. Because Japan has comparative advantage in computers. This specialization معناها specialization means you put most or all your resources in the production of that good. واحنا نذكره في chapter 1, we talk that economics is always about the management of scarce resources. Okay, so you put all your resources in the good in which you are specialized. This is what's the result of this? The result of this, that total production in the world would increase, will become higher. Total production in all countries increases. Okay. And the world's economic pie is bigger. مش معناها the pie in economic pie. Economic pie معناها it means production actually. It means production. Okay, don't. It means production. World's production is world's economic production becomes big, and all countries gain from trade. This specialization makes all countries gain from trade. وهنا شفنا احنا هنا في this example. The slide number 20. Okay, so please be careful in explaining which country would export which product. Which country would export this product is a question that can be answered by the comparative advantage, by looking for the comparative advantage, not by looking into the absolute advantage. Okay, it is important to answer one of your questions. It is important to understand both types of costs, both types of advantages, comparative and absolute, in order to distinguish between themselves and understand better the concept or the theory of comparative advantage. While the absolute advantage is based on absolute costs, fewer inputs, etc., the comparative advantage is based on another type of cost we call opportunity costs. It is based on the difference of opportunity costs.